Are you holding back on travel plans because you're afraid of the language gap? Well, no need to mind the gap if you have Babbel. Speak like a whole new you with Babbel, the language learning app that gets you talking. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you talking a new language in 3 weeks. Because talking is the key to really knowing a language. Babbel is designed for real conversation. And I can say that that's true because I used Babbel before my recent trip. I went on to Germany, which is a language that I never studied before, but I really wanted to be just comfortable with things like navigating my way around a train station or a bus station, to be able to order food in a cafe, or to say I'm sorry if I bump into somebody on the street, and Babbel was perfect for that. So I was able to travel over there with confidence, knowing just a bit more German than I did before. Here's a special holiday deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Bingo Blitz rules!
If your bingo has ads in it,
That's not a bingo.
if it doesn't have the coolest tournaments, mini games, and the most breathtaking design,
Nope, not a bingo.
if your bingo moment makes you feel so excited that you just want to burst in joy and scream out loud, bingo! Sorry, so you're playing...
Bingo Blitz? Now that's a bingo. Discover a world of excitement with Bingo Blitz, the #1 free bingo game. Download Bingo Blitz and play for free.
Now that's a bingo.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and if you can hear purring behind me, that is my co-host, who is my cat, Hepburn. So this episode is part of Season 7, and Season 7 of Vulgar History has the theme, How do you solve a problem like Marie Antoinette? And what that means in terms of this show is we're looking at the world around Marie Antoinette, the world that she lived in, which was a pretty chaotic time. There was so much change going on at such a rapid pace, kind of like today. Astrologically, things were also similar if you're someone who is into that sort of stuff. So in the first part of Season 7, what we looked at was a lot of what was going on in the Americas. And we talked quite a bit about enslavement and what that meant. And then this part, Season 7, Part 2, we're looking at what was happening back in France. And today's story is somebody who really combines what was happening in France, the Versailles of it all, as well as Marie Antoinette herself makes an appearance in this. This is somebody who was around during the French Revolution, which is an important part of this century that we're talking about, as well as this season. And he also connects back to the slavery that was going on in the Caribbean and in the Americas at this time, the chattel slavery of people from Africa. And I say he, if you notice that, we usually talk about women on this show, but we're taking a broader scope this season, and I think rightly so, because this was an era where lots of people were leading revolutionary lives, and I really have long wanted to discuss this person on the podcast. It just took me a while to find out. I mean, it's so ideal for this season just because of all the things the story incorporates, but I also really wanted to do justice to this figure who is Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. I really wanted to find a guest who could really help illuminate the story. And so first I want to say, he has come up on this podcast before, Chevalier de Saint-Georges. If you listen back to the episode I did a bit ago about the Chevalier d'Eon, who was the amazing sword-fighting spy trans woman, I did that episode with Maya Dean. And Maya actually brought up the Chevalier de Saint-Georges in that because Chevalier de Saint-Georges had stuff to do with the Chevalier d'Eon. I wanted to let you know, Chevalier means knight, like Knight, and that is both of their titles. Anyway, so my interest was piqued at that point, and then also the local, I'm going to talk about this in the interview you're about to hear, the local symphony orchestra here where I live in Saskatoon did a concert of the works of the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and I really enjoyed it. And there was in the program just writing about who he was as a person, and I was just like, oh, I really want to learn more about him. I want to talk about him on the podcast, but again, I really want to do justice to the story. I really wanted to have a special guest, and I found a special guest. So today's guest, who you're going to hear, is Julian Ledford, who is Assistant Professor of French and French Studies at Sewanee, the University of the South in Tennessee. So he specializes in early modern French and Francophone literature with a particular focus on Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier of Saint-Georges, as well as 18th century women writers' contributions to discussions on masculinities. He was so generous with his time to come and join us on this podcast. And I do want to mention before we get into it, just what some of the sources were from my research. He does his own research, but what I consulted to understand the story before I spoke with him was a book called The Chevalier de Saint-Georges, Virtuoso of the Sword and the Bow by Gabriel Bonat, as well as 2 academic articles, Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, Man of Music and Gentleman at Arms by also Gabriel Bonat, and then also Julian Ledford's essay, Joseph Bologne, The Chevalier de Saint-Georges and the Problem with Black Mozart. So there's links to all of those things in the show notes if you want to do your own research as well after this. But otherwise, I'm just going to get myself out of the way because I'm excited for you all to hear. I'm so excited to talk about Chevalier de Saint-Georges on this podcast. So please enjoy this interview with Julian Ledford. So Julian, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Anne.
I'm very excited to have this conversation with you, and I'm really glad that you agreed to come on here because when I'm doing my research and I find somebody who is clearly passionate about the person I'm researching, I think I should just get that person on the show. So the first question I have for you is, do you remember how you first found out about Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges?
I do agree with you that I am passionate about this work, and it's odd to say, but it was just a random happenstance. It just happened randomly in my life that, I stumbled upon Saint-Georges. I don't want to say it was fate because that makes it seem, I don't know, that I was destined to meet this person, but it's really just through a random search online. Now, what led into the search is interesting because, growing up in Jamaica after college and in grad school, classical music was my entire thing. I did piano, I, studied composition. I went to a music conservatory for grad work. And, I thought I knew, everything, not everything there was to know about classical music, but I thought I knew the greats. I could maybe go on Jeopardy and do very, very well in that, sphere. But, trying to merge my interest in music with my, study of French literature was interesting. I really struggled to find the true connection between the two, French studies, Francophone studies, and music. And so I was encouraged by, a former chair of the department at a school I was at to, do some investigation, do some, introspection, try to find out, what would interest your students and what would also be your passion. And, so I was sort of aimless for a while and happened to look up 18th century French composers. And this name stuck out to me, a name I didn't recognize. I clicked on it. And what happened next was, a series of me being embarrassed, which is hard to say, but I just thought, well, I didn't ever hear about this man. And it's not just like, he's not just, from what I'm seeing, not just a flash in the pan, there's so much to know about him. And so that just led me on this path of discovery, trying to undo my ignorance and doing as much as I can to, share his message of his work with my students, my colleagues, with, everyone who will listen, I guess. So that's what led me to Saint-Georges.
I wanted to just let you know where I first heard about him as well, because it was also fairly random, which was where I live in Canada. So I attend the local symphony performances when I can, and just whatever they were performing, I go and I hear and I enjoy. And they were doing a concert of St. George's music, and I thought, so just they advertised it, and I thought, oh, well, I've never heard of this composer. And then I went, and in the program there was maybe a page sort of explaining who he was, and there was the famous portrait of him. And I thought, this is such an interesting person. Why?
Exactly.
Why have I? And then the concert too. I really liked the music. Like, I loved the music. I thought I appreciate this man as a composer, but his life story was so interesting.
Exactly. It's the two things, it's the talent that's out there, his output, but then just, the mystery, I would say, surrounding his life and just the intrigue there. It's, just so much to learn and so much to explore.
So if you're here to kind of help us explain who he was, I mean, as much as we can in an hour. So what do we know about who his parents were and where he grew up?
He was born in Guadeloupe, so French territory, colonized by the French in the Caribbean. His mother was called Nanon, N-A-N-O-N, and she was an enslaved African born in Guadeloupe, but, into slavery on a plantation there. And his father was an enslaver, a white planter from France who lived in Guadeloupe. And so, of course, his father was married and had other children, but eventually had an affair with Saint-Georges' mother. And that's how he was born. So technically, he was also born into slavery on the island of Guadeloupe. Now, he happened to be the only son of his father. So, he was the one who would eventually, if anything, carry on the family legacy. But being an illegitimate child, but it's true, he was not considered to be a natural son, a natural son of his father because of condition of his mother being enslaved. But being the only son, though, he was given a lot of attention. And this is where it gets a little curious because, he could have been abandoned. He could have been, left on the plantation to, follow the fate of his mom, which is to, have a life of servitude. And then eventually the earned freedom through some sort of benevolence on the part of the father or something else. But his dad seemed to place a lot of attention, on him. Like he seemed to want him to distinguish himself in different circles. So, and this would have been something that Saint-Georges' father learned or maybe saw patterned for him by his own parents or maybe other men in the family. If you were Boulogne, you're supposed to take care of your children, especially your sons. It could have been that. It could have been something, I don't know, spectacular or something sort of, I don't know, distinguishing that was already innate in young Saint-Georges that made his father want to, pay attention to him and maybe invest in his future. It's also true that Nanon, his mother, was very beautiful and was actually loved by Saint-Georges' father. So it was more than just a casual fling that brought out Saint-Georges. It was true emotion, true love, true affection for his mother, and eventually true affection for the son, Saint-Georges, that I think made the father want to invest in him. And so, it's still unclear how he eventually became so talented in composition and music and violin. But we know that his father was a patron of the arts. He's someone who, would have paid to have his son get the best training, right? Because if the son is supposed to distinguish himself in courtly circles, then, through music and through maybe the combative arts would be, two domains in which Saint-Georges should, have some preparation. And so I think his father was very, very active in making sure that in the future, Saint-Georges could choose between the two, or maybe, excel in both, in music and also in, as we know, fencing eventually. His fate from his birth, and he was born on the 25th of December, which is also very interesting. But his fate seemed to have been affected by true emotion, true affection for him, and for his mother. And also just the willingness to invest in him as the only son of his father.
I think just from what I was reading and I'm not a musician myself, but you would know this better than I would. For somebody to excel as much as he did at violin playing and at composition, like he would have had to have, people are trying to backwards deduce what was his life like. And he has to have been trained from childhood to have reached the level he was.
I think so. He must have been some sort of prodigy before, because, in his 20s, if he's already the rage in his 20s, he couldn't have started playing violin as a teenager. It doesn't seem to make much sense. He would have been exposed to the art, to music, to composition, perhaps to, that instrument at a much earlier age. There are some, and you're right, some people are probably saying, some researchers are saying that he probably an instructor from a different Caribbean country and that he probably spent time outside of Guadeloupe, training before he got to France. Once again, I haven't found any documentation to prove that, but it stands to reason that if in his 20s he was so, already established as a musician, he must have had prior training.
So he was brought to France to attend school primarily, I think, right?
Yes, yes.
So there was only so much education that he could be provided in Guadeloupe. So his father brought him to France, and this is where, you mentioned, so that we've talked about the music, but so he was also amazing at fencing. And so he became known from a young age as this expert fencer. So there was one notable fencing match that he was involved with, and this led to him to some changes in his circumstances. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So this talented boy from Guadeloupe not only was able to distinguish himself as a violinist, but as a fencer. And it's true that he was the underdog. He was called. He was a mulatto. He was a person of color. He was of mixed race. And having someone of his diversity do well in fencing was unheard of. This was not a normal thing. So no one would bet on him to win any sort of fencing exhibition, any sort of fencing match. But it so happened that he was, getting a lot of attention because of his diversity, because of his, peculiar circumstances by many people, including the king, those who were interested in gambling, I would say, or maybe placing bets on who would become Europe's greatest fencer, or France's greatest fencer. And there was Saint-Georges, who was set up eventually to fence against Picard, who was, at the time, the leading fencer in the country. And of course, I think a lot of persons would have bet against Saint-Georges, meaning that they, thought he would lose. And apparently he did not, which, of course, was a huge shock. To have this young, unheard of person of color who's sort of very mysterious come to France and actually outdo one of the leading fencers. And so because of that, it maybe just as a symbolic gesture, the king, granted him the title of Chevalier, and it meant that he would be a part of the entourage to protect the king. So a part of the cavalry, those who are riding horses or who have weapons, who can be called upon to protect the king and to protect the court. And so I think that was eventually what his father would have wanted for him. Like, this is, exactly why I invested in Saint-Georges, my son, was for him to distinguish himself this way. So his father must have been very proud. But that was only the beginning, as we know. This was not just a one-off thing. He would eventually become, they call him the Hercules, the French Hercules, pretty much, because of his fencing and his talent in other sports as well. This is, athleticism in general. He just dominated all those spheres and earned the title of Chevalier. It wasn't given to him because of, his blood or any inheritance or any sort of, lineage that he had, but through his talent for fencing and other athletic feats. Yeah.
I was doing the research for this and reading just while the Paris Olympics were on, which was interesting because some of the places that they were having exhibitions were very ancient, they're Versailles and things. But I was also thinking about when, in terms of St. George and his talent and his skill level, so that made me think like, okay, he's like Simone Biles. He is so impressive beyond anything anyone has ever seen. And that just sort of framed it for me because I don't know about a fencing celebrity, but I know about Simone Biles. Right. I know how people are.
You are so right. You are so right, because I think it's hard for us to fathom how great he was, because we think, okay, in today's world, we have athletes, we have the Olympics, as you said, we have, different stars in different countries who are very popular, especially in tennis as well. A lot of tennis stars who make millions of dollars just for showing up. And for us, it's almost normalized. But go back to the 18th century, with this man who, was unknown pretty much. And for him to rise to the very, very top, the pinnacle of the performing arts, also the, as I said, athletics, was unheard of. He was truly great. He was, exceptionally tremendous. And it's almost hard for us to understand that. But you're completely right. If you think of him as like one of the first Simone Biles of France, I think that's starting to help us to understand how great of a legacy he had. Yeah.
Well, and that's where it's interesting because he, just in me reading kind of the biography, he sort of pivots to turn more to his skill at music. And there was, in the one book I read, it was imagining what would the audience think if they show up to this symphony concert and you see, wait, why is Simone Biles playing first violin?
Right.
And then it turns out she is Yo-Yo Ma. She's also
I know. Right, exactly. In this one being, you have such talent, and it's true. I mean, something else to think about is that today we sort of separate skill. We say, okay, you have to choose, either you're going to be in the performing arts or you're going to be an athlete. You have to choose between, I don't know, the sciences or the arts or humanities or whatever it is, But at the time, excellence had no bounds, it wasn't a sort of decision whether or not you'd excel in one thing and not the other. But why not excel at everything that you touch, everything that's maybe given to you? And for Saint-Georges, I don't think he had the option to not excel, which we can talk about later. But moving from fencing and adding the violin, adding music, seemed for him, I think, was what he needed to do to survive, what he needed to do to continue his social climb in French society.
Actually, can we talk about that for a minute? So how he was accepted, his social climb, because he was accepted everywhere.
Yeah, this is true. And I hope this doesn't sound as if I'm, being reductive or I'm trying to injure or damage his legacy, but he was someone to bet on, as I said before. When you have Saint-Georges on your roster, on the program, if he's involved in your performance, if he's involved in whatever you're doing, you'll have bodies in the seats, you'll have people paying to see him, right? So he was someone who would guarantee success, financial success, right? And so, people were clamoring to see him, clamoring to have him on their stage. And so it's true that fame that he probably first earned as a fencer carried over to the domain of music, and it opened many doors for him. He was invited into, different spaces dominated by men, by women. He was invited to, take part in various concerts. He was a sort of, I don't know, maybe not pawn, but he was usually sent to secure alliances between different courts. So once again, he was so talented, and he had his finger on he understood taste as well. He understood what people liked. He understood what would excite the masses. And so he was, you could not go wrong with inviting Saint-Georges.
Exactly, that if he's at your party, then people are going to come to your party.
Yeah, and they'll come back, and they'll come and they'll stay and they'll come again. It's not a one-off thing like, oh, let's go see this exotic person, do a backflip or let's sing a little bit. No, let's see what this person has done in the time since we've seen him last. What does he come up with in the last couple months or a couple weeks? What new invention will there be? So he was someone to have once, but someone to invite again, which made him, very successful.
And I think that's almost, I would say, he excelled as in fencing and athletics. He excelled in the musical sphere. And I would say he also excelled socially. He was just, his charisma, his personality, that was also part of it. People just like to be around him, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think you're right. He was, I've seen it mentioned maybe in 3 separate places in the archives that he had a certain, maybe not violent, but vibrant temperament. He was a lively person. He wasn't a dud to begin with, and so not that he would sort of drama or he would be, thrown to maybe temper tantrums, not that, but he was someone who maybe had a very active mind. We take part in different discussions. He would always have an opinion, but to counter that, he was someone who really believed in friendship. He had close friends, and in a poem that was written about him, when his I think you've mentioned this famous portrait that you saw at this concert you went to recently. That portrait also had a poem, written to actually be published at the same time. And the poem speaks about his love of his friends, and that the love for his friends actually, gave him a source of comfort and helped him to navigate, what was a very, I guess a difficult life for him, right? So we have a very sweet, kind, loyal person, and someone who is also extremely animated, who, sure, from time to time would get into maybe different scraps. Maybe he would say too much, or maybe get involved in maybe the wrong company, but his friends would always have to forgive him for that because he made up for it by being such a loyal and, kind and loving person. Yeah.
So can you talk about, just in terms of, from what I was reading, sort of his first major musical group, I guess I'll call it, is the Concert des Amateurs.
Yes. This is one of the groups I think that, actually helped his climb in French society. And so the Concert des Amateurs was created by Gossec, who's a well-established French composer, violinist, someone who had tried before in the past to create his own orchestra. And, he had, to some success, but, nothing really long-lasting. And then what he did, Gossec, was that he knew about Saint-Georges' talent. He knew about Saint-Georges' pull, that he was able to attract crowds, attract different audience goers. He dedicated some music. I think it was 6 violin concertos, I think it was, to Saint-Georges, to say, these are written for you, meaning that, to be an honor for you to perform them, right? And so by doing that, Gossec sort of solidified this relationship between himself and Saint-Georges. And then eventually Saint-Georges was, once this orchestra was created, Saint-Georges was invited to play, with the amateur. And I think with this orchestra, it was very interesting. It was a mixture of, let's say, professional musicians and also the amateurs, the amateur, So it was a mixture of people of different talents, different levels of, I say maybe skill. So there is Saint-Georges, who is probably one of the most skilled violinists, who's playing pieces that were written for him, right, by Gossec. And if he's on the stage, as we've said before, then you're in for, something that is truly spectacular, truly exciting and passionate music. And so Gossec was thrilled to have Saint-Georges on the stage because you have, at once, a thriving orchestra with people coming to your performances, people paying to be there. Also, if you have music that is written for Saint-Georges, right, and music that's performed by Saint-Georges, it's true that different orchestras would pay to rent this music, rent the score, right? So it's a lot of income, a lot of revenue coming into this orchestra, thanks to Saint-Georges. So I believe, it makes sense for him not just to be a visitor, maybe playing the first violin, being the chair, but eventually to become the leader of the Concert des Amateurs. So it was, again, a no-brainer. If he's linked to your orchestra, your orchestra will be successful, which it was.
And I think also I just want to clarify for people that Saint-Georges was a working musician. He needed this income for himself as well. He wasn't independently wealthy.
No, exactly. So, he was also benefiting from this too. That's completely true. I mean, we say he couldn't drop any catches. I'll try to explain that. I think it's a sports reference in baseball or maybe cricket. If you're in the outfield and there's a fly ball or something, if you catch it, it means that you get the person out who's batting and your team kind of moves closer to winning. So that was Saint-Georges in the outfield. He needed to make those catches. He needed to have those connections. He needed to be invited back and needed to have music dedicated to him, right? For him to actually have to make his living. So that's completely correct. Yeah.
And he was also composing at the same time as well.
Yes. And I think what's interesting there is that he didn't really care to repeat traditions. He was willing to break with traditions, to maybe try new harmonies, to invite I say invite, not force, but invite musicians to develop different hand positions to perform his music. He required you know musicians to study his work and to find new ways to perform it, find new ways of playing the instrument in order to perform his work. And that just drove people crazy in a good way. It drove interest. It drove, this curiosity about classical music at the time. And as I said, it would make sense. If he's written these scores and they're in these libraries, then different orchestras, not only in France but around Europe, would want to rent the scores and have their orchestras play the music and see if their orchestras can attract the same sort of crowd and fury, rage, and good fury about this new type of music. So he was ingenious in that sense and very, very smart, Saint-Georges.
Can you describe the type of composition he would do sometimes? I forget the name of it, but it's where you have two soloists almost dueling each other.
Yes, yeah, the symphonie concertante. So it's true. You have this, let's say, binary. You have the orchestra playing against soloists, not one soloist, but soloists. So, and then the soloists have their own tete-a-tete, their own duo going on, or their own battle. And, some researchers or historians will say that it's almost as if Saint-Georges was staging a fencing match on the stage. Yeah, this jousting, this, back and forth between the soloists. And then a third dimension would be the orchestra coming in to maybe punctuate that little duo happening on stage between the soloists. So it was, he was considered, Saint-Georges, one of the pioneers of this musical form. Other composers around Europe would eventually, try their hand at this art form. But he's considered to be one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer, of the symphonie concertante. Yeah, but it's. Can you imagine? It's adding this dimension of combat, the art of combat. On the stage in this, new dramatic, spectacular form, and I think it was it went over well. Let's say that with the audience at the time.
I love the way you described it as almost like a fencing match, and of course it was, because that was who he was. Also, the way that he combined his two passions. It's interesting.
Very, very interesting. And I'll tell you, I have not been, this is embarrassing to say, but I've not been to a live performance of Saint-Georges' music. I've seen, different videos on YouTube, and, I've tried to watch different documentaries, and, but I've not yet been to a live performance. So you're way ahead of me in that regard, but I'm, do you remember what sort of emotions you had? Was it thrilling to see this on stage when you went in Canada?
Well, I feel like you and I would be the opposite situations, because I went to the concert and I learned about him at the same time I heard the music, whereas you would be going to the concert with so much knowledge and so much expectation. So I was the whole thing, like reading his biography in the program and hearing the music. And for me with classical music, I'm a sort of person who I know the major pieces, and I like to go to a concert and hear a piece that I know. And when I go to a concert and I don't know the musician, I may enjoy it, I may not enjoy it. But this one, I had never heard any of the music before, and it was there's something about it. I just remember it was delightful. It was the music was fun.
That's the word. Fun.
So everything we've been talking about, he's so impressive. He's embraced by society. All of these things are doing well. And then we haven't talked a lot about how his race affected his life, but it really suddenly kind of stopped his momentum. And this is when he wanted to become the director of the Paris Opera.
Right.
And he was stopped. Yeah. Can you explain that situation?
It's true that we haven't mentioned a lot about his race, and it makes it seem as if it was it was of no consequence, that his talent was all that mattered, talent and his ability to make money. So nothing about race. But it's true that, and I think it's the same today, where in certain spheres, I would say, that if you're a person of color in, a domain that is, usually dominated by persons who are maybe, let's say, white, you could say that, you're only expected to be so good. You're only allowed to go so far. You can be my neighbor. We can coexist, but there's no position, there's no way that you're going to become superior to me, that I will take, I'll take direction from you. I think that's exactly what happened with the Paris Opera. He was in line to become the director of the Paris Opera, which was this huge institution, still is. Can you imagine a time where, information and entertainment and political power and the cultural power, all of that was found in the opera. A lot of money as well. A lot of investors, a lot of exchange of great ideas also happened in the opera. And Saint-Georges was in line to become the director of the Paris Opera. And it's true that the Paris Opera in the mid 1760s was struggling. Let's say that, because a great French composer, Rameau, died. And, there's really no one who had come up as yet with any great skill to, enliven or to reinvigorate the French opera. But of course, there's Saint-Georges. And as I said, you always bet on that man to bring the people. So they said, sure, it seemed, clear, it's a no-brainer that Saint-Georges would become the new director. As it turns out, not everyone was, happy with that, including three actresses. Yes, I think, a singer, a dancer, and someone else, linked to the French opera, who wrote a letter to Marie Antoinette, and they're complaining. They're saying, we just don't see how we can be expected to take directions from a mulatto. It's for them, it would be unheard of. And I'm not. There's not an apology for what they said, but at that time, in this 18th century, how could the son of an enslaved African woman, a mulatto, a person of color, be in a position of power, to be superior to, these three French women? And so for them, it was like, well, clearly this cannot happen. Yeah, and apparently because of that letter, it did, cause a stir in the court, and Saint-Georges was not his candidacy was not put through for the directorship of the opera. Other scholars will say that these actresses were acting out of fear. Yes, that they thought that if Saint-Georges came in with his, his spirit to break tradition, someone who did not really honor tradition as well. He was known for breaking tradition, for to innovate in all parts of his life. They thought, well, if this new man comes in with his new ideas and his unorthodox ways of being, he's going to fire us. He's going to find new singers. He's going to find new dancers. We'll be out of work. And so some are saying it's not just racism, but just their egos and their fear of not having a career. And so again, it's not an apology for their behavior, but it is true that Saint-Georges was made aware of his race. I do think in a very striking way that in 1777, in the year when he lost one of his best friends, this happened. He was must have been devastated.
I mean, I'm sure that every day of his life, his race and his skin color would have affected what he was doing, but that was the first. It halted what was just seemed like an inevitable progression of success for him.
Yes, I agree. I mean, and what would have happened? Had he become the director of the Paris Opera? Can you imagine to have the first person of color at that time to occupy that huge position? What would have become of the French opera? What would have become of French music? He could have been much more of a, I don't know, his legacy, his prominence would have been much greater had he been allowed to occupy that space. But it's true that he didn't just go home and cry. He did eventually go on to write other operas that were well received. Well, the first one wasn't, but others were. So it didn't completely thwart his progress, and it didn't completely kill his spirit. But one has to wonder what would have happened had he been allowed to. That language you use, it's maybe not helpful because it's still hypotheticals. But you're completely right. He was it was a no-brainer. He should have been the director of the Paris Opera.
And so he continued doing, I found everything about his life surprised me, what he did next. So like the music was always there with him. He was always composing or playing. But then at this point in his life, he was called upon to travel to London to spend time with George, the Prince of Wales, and to do some fencing exhibitions. Can you talk about that?
Interesting. I think this goes back to his friendship with Philippe Égalité, the Duke of Orléans. So the Philippe Le Gros, this is Philippe Égalité's dad, was Saint-Georges' greatest benefactor, I would say. He invited Saint-Georges to, live in the courtly residences. He was, very protective of Saint-Georges. And so, Saint-Georges had a loyalty to this family. Now, Philippe Le Gros, his son, Philippe Égalité, was around the same age as Saint-Georges. So they kind of grew up together. They're in the same entourage, of course. But it's true that Philippe Égalité, he sort of he saw himself as becoming someone great, someone who's going to become the next king of France, if need be, because he was, the first prince of blood, so he was linked through blood to the monarchy, linked through blood to, the French throne. And so he did eventually want to see himself becoming, the new king. Now, he was linked to Saint-Georges, sort of a friendship. I wouldn't say they were the best of friends. I think, as I said, just loyalty and the fact they're the same age, and that, Saint-Georges, had been around the family for a while. They're friends. It's also true that in England, the Prince of Wales, this is George, or maybe Prinny as they called him, he was also in line to become the king of England because his father had a sort of mental illness that made it difficult for him to be an efficient ruler. So in 1788, you have both men who are thinking, okay, we are going to be the future kings, of our countries. We should form this alliance. We should start, maybe solidifying or bond, as we head into, bigger things. And there you have Saint-Georges in the middle, right? And it is true that Philippe Égalité knew that the Prince of Wales loved boxing, loved fencing. And so I think he used Saint-Georges as a way of maybe solidifying that deal, maybe flexing his power by saying, at my disposal, in my entourage, I have the greatest fencer of Europe, and I will send him to England. He will he'll have an exhibition there, and I know that you love fencing, so I do you a favor, and eventually you'll do one for me. So it's a sort of bargaining chip, I think. But for Saint-Georges, he was not a simpleton. He knew that if he went to England and he fenced for the prince, he would be paid. He would receive lavish gifts, which he did receive, but also he would earn for himself a new audience. He'd not only have audiences in France, but also now in England, a country that was much more progressive in terms of tolerance, than France was. So he went sure on the bidding of Philippe Égalité, but also for his own interest. I'm pretty sure he went knowing that I will come back with, maybe enough in terms of money and, maybe potential money and maybe income from my new audience if I go to England. And so I think that's a part of what happened there.
I just wanted to mention to the listeners, because I have done an episode before about the Chevalier d'Eon. And that is, there was this big exhibition match, and there's a painting of it. And St. George was fencing against the Chevalier d'Eon. And I've seen that painting 100 times. And I just didn't realize that was the context of it. And I didn't realize that St. George is the opponent in that painting. Yeah. And now for a quick advertising break.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This time of the year can certainly bring out the spooky and scary. And while you probably can't talk through the threat of zombies and ghosts, for other fears in your life, therapy is a great tool for finding ways to overcome them. Personally, I find it much scarier not to address the things I need to, because I know those are the things that are preventing me from living the life that I want. For example, a fear of vulnerability is a big thing that I've been discussing in therapy and with friends, and at the same time, I have always wanted to prioritize deep connections with my loved ones. Turns out, the way to deepen my relationships? It's confronting that fear of vulnerability. I'm learning it's important to show my authentic self in order to have authentic, deep connections. And that's not an easy thing to do, but luckily, we don't have to do this alone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just need to fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you have the ability to switch therapists at any time, for any reason, for no additional charge. Overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/vulgar today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/vulgar.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
O72 B1.
Bingo! Oh, no big deal. Just want a bingo. You know it is a huge deal? Son of a blitz! Bingo Blitz is giving away a free phone every hour. Seriously, it's Drew. I mean, it's true. Download now.
Download Bingo Blitz on the App Store or Google Play today. It's free. No purchase is necessary. 21 or older. See official rules at bingoblitz.com.
With something like 5 million podcasts, finding a really good one can take a ton of time. So let me recommend one. It's called Something You Should Know. I'm the host, Mike Carruthers, and in each episode, we discuss topics that can be really helpful, like how to read people better, the psychology of crowds, or fun things like the story of Legos, or why you probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for horses. Something You Should Know is the name of it, wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back.
Yeah, and what a fascinating figure, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. I mean, I would love to listen to your podcast on that, because that's another, just looking at the Saint-Georges entourage of people who animated his life, so eclectic, so, I don't know, intriguing, in their own right. And this person, this Chevalier, was just one of them, who just is so, I don't know, interesting as a figure. But yeah, there's Saint-Georges, fencing, with this exhibition match with, his new audience looking at him. And, to what extent did he throw the match? To what extent did he actually, allow himself to be, I don't know, the best fencer in the moment? Was it staged? There's so much to unearth. Yeah.
So, I mean, again, it's just, I was just reading through this biography that I read. It's just, what's going to happen next? Like, everything is just one adventure after another.
as you said, reading through, I was recently looking through some archives and the some British newspaper archives, and so Saint-Georges in 1788, is in England, he's 1788, 1789, and then eventually I find out that he opened this arts club, I think maybe a sporting exhibition club in England, you know, where he was supposed to be the main, the main attraction. And of course, the journalists are wondering who paid for this and who are the wealthy patrons who will go. So he was just always, trying to reinvent himself, trying to, maybe opening himself up to new experiences, So I want to do more work on this to figure out where this club existed and what happened in this club, who was there, was he boxing, was he fencing, was it gambling? I don't know, but it's just interesting.
And that also, just describing that as just one more thing he was doing, I often think that it's a very modern thing for people to have, a job and a job on the side and another job. But, or when you think about celebrities, it's like someone is an actor, but then they also have a tequila line and they also do skincare.
Right.
But he was doing that. Like, it feels very contemporary to me that he was just finding whatever ways to make money he could based on the fact that he was this celebrity.
Exactly. I think you're completely right.
But then again, he's excelling in so many ways. But my next question is about his romantic relationships. But again, it comes back to his race, which is that he was not able to marry. He could not marry a woman of his choice. He could not marry a white woman. And if he was going to marry a black woman, he would probably lose his prestige and his status. He was known to have, I think, everybody in his entourage. They all had many romantic entanglements. This was a libertine group of people. But then specifically, so he had a relationship, allegedly, with a woman, Marie Josephine de Montalembert, and that led to some drama. Can you talk about what happened with that?
So you're completely right. In his entourage, he had many people, including many women, and because he was a person in the theater, he was linked to different patronesses of the arts, people who had their own private theaters. And two of these women happened to be Madame de Montesson, as you've was, one of the leading patronesses of the arts. She had the leading private theater. And she happened to, on top of that, be able to secure Saint-Georges as one of the directors. So she was winning in every sense of the way. Another person, another woman in this entourage was the Madame de Montalembert, who was younger than Madame de Montesson, who was not as experienced, and whose theater wasn't really thriving. So she went to Madame de Montesson to ask for help, to say, well, could you allow me to, willing to lend, pretty much, lend me Saint-Georges so that he can help my theater and, maybe get some seats into the chairs. Some bodies into the chairs. And surprisingly, this was allowed, this happened. And I think, again, that Saint-Georges did this because he also had interest in working with Madame de Montalembert. I think so. So, we have these two people who are working together to, create this thriving theater. And the rumors have it, the columnists, different gossip columns and everything, picked up on maybe a sort of fondness between the two. They're thinking it was more than just friendship, that there was actually an actual affair going on. And this led to, they're saying as well, the birth of a child, which was, extremely, extremely controversial because, first of all, it's a child, another body that's there that has to be explained. And most likely to be a person, and the child would maybe bear resemblance to the father in some way, saying that, okay, in the color of the skin, perhaps, it would be obvious who the father was. And so even if these were only rumors, the Général de Montalembert would have been, completely upset, completely thrown off by, rumors about his wife having an affair with Europe's greatest fencer, this huge celebrity that everyone was talking about, the famous Saint-Georges. to be, rumored about having a relationship with, his wife, it would have been too much, right? So as the story goes, this general, he saw to it that the son, this child, was not cared for, and the child died and was, disposed of. And supposedly, in order to maybe seal the deal, to completely maybe save his honor, he arranged for 6 men to to attempt an assassination on Saint-Georges. This, was not successful. Saint-Georges managed to defend himself, even though, guns were involved and, shots were fired. But he was not fatally injured, just maybe, scratched up and, sort of beaten up, but he survived. So according to the stories, according to what's written, allegedly, this General de Montalbert was the one who actually orchestrated that attack.
Well, I'm just thinking everything we know. Well, you mentioned guns were involved too, but I was thinking, well, if they came with swords, like, of course he's going to defeat them because he's
right. This great fencer.
Yeah, but I just feel like they came to attack him. It's like going after a superhero or something. Like I'm glad that he escaped, but also, of course, he did. He's so athletic, so clever.
Right.
And then, I mean, we're getting closer and closer. So the French Revolution occurs.
Right. That little thing happened.
Yeah, it is talking about things that sort of alter the trajectory of his life. So so he had been in, he was spending time playing music with Marie Antoinette and staying with all these aristocrats who are now under threat. And so what was his point of view about the French Revolution? How did he become involved?
Yeah, as you said, I don't think he had a choice, to be honest, because if his life thus far, was really heavily influenced by the court. Even in his name, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, this idea of him being so close to the nobility, and then you have a time when the nobility is enemy number one. This hatred and this idea that all of the 900 years of servitude, has been is now linked to the nobility, and they're trying to be, I don't know, they're being killed, exterminated. Then Saint-Georges had no other choice but to, distance himself from the court, and as much as possible as he could. He wanted to be seen as a patriot, someone who supported the revolution, someone who was not a royalist supporting the monarchy. Even though his track record kind of made it difficult for him to do so. But there's a pamphlet that we have that's been attributed to him, and so my work now is to try to prove that this was actually a pamphlet written by Saint-Georges. But in this pamphlet, it's this idea that there are true citizens out there, there are true patriots, there are those who are fighting for the good of the nation. But there are two other factions. There are those who are the royalists, the monarchy. And then you have a third slippery faction, those people who are there who are working only for self-aggrandizement. They're just there to feed their ego, to see how much they can gain from causing anarchy, And one person called out is Robespierre, who was eventually the leader or the instigator of the French Terror, which is, this very violent, bloody, gory period of the French Revolution where, as the story goes, there was like just human blood, just washing the streets of Paris. And, in that period of time, even if you were suspected of having an idea that went counter to the leading ideas of the time, then you were considered a traitor and you could be imprisoned and, decapitated. And so it's true that Saint-Georges was imprisoned. We don't know why. It's not really clear as to why, but there are many reasons. It could have been his connection to the court, his connection to the Prince of Wales, his connection to to Philippe Égalité. It could be because of his involvement in the National Guard. That people were saying it was not as invested in the cause of the revolution, but more so interested in his music performances. So he was put in prison. And it must have been a very, frightful time for him because for any reason, he could have been decapitated. He could have been killed. But luckily that didn't happen. But I do think in terms of the revolution, he wanted to be seen as someone on the right side. Now, we don't know his true intentions. I'm pretty sure he would have wanted to, secure his life in many ways, either to rely on the old patrons that he had before, in those privileged circles, but also to keep his neck on his body, like, so he was maybe torn. But in the pamphlet, if it's truly written by him, he wants to be seen as citizen Saint-Georges, not Chevalier de Saint-Georges, but a citizen who's a true patriot. Yeah.
So he winds up in a town called Lille, and this is where his next pivot is to become an army leader. So the Légion de Saint-Georges.
Exactly. Yeah. So in Lille, in the north of France now, he's not in Paris anymore, in north of France, and there's his new home, and it's in the newspaper clippings, we see that the people of Lille love that he was there, and he loved, being in Lille as well. He did exhibition matches there, and eventually there's a national call to defend the north of France from intrusion from Austrian, other countries, other let's say monarchies that were trying to affect the French Revolution. And so Saint-Georges was one of the first people to sign up to become a part of the National Guard. And then a couple of years later, there's a call to have free men of color join and create this regiment of soldiers to continue defending, the border. And Saint-Georges was once again, just like with the Paris Opera, he was, it was a no-brainer that he would be the director of this new Légion, or the Legion of St. George, which he accepted. And I think, it was the first army of men of color of the time. And as the story goes, he was not the best leader. I'm not sure if this can be believed because, once again, you take everything with a grain of salt when it comes to the criticism of him and praise as well. But apparently he didn't manage funds really well. So mismanagement of funds was an issue, and that he, didn't seem interested in the work. He was more so interested in, bringing glory to himself. That he's in this position to, gain an audience again, because he's a performer, right? So if he's a performer, for him to survive, he needs an audience. And so he's doing this just to be in the limelight again. And he's eventually gone off to Belgium to the concert, and he's left us without, any director and leadership. And, so he was eventually seen, and this might have led to him being imprisoned, that, his true interest lied in bringing glory to himself and his fame and his celebrity, as opposed to, being a true citizen to protect the French border. Yeah. So I'm not sure where I fall on that. I think it was a very difficult position to hold and a very difficult time to be a person in the French Revolution. It changed everything,
It's impressive to me that he made so many shifts throughout his life. Like, okay, now I'm going to do this. Oh, now the world is doing this. Now we're going to do this. Like, even if he wasn't the greatest, army general, he still survived. So he got to live another day.
Right.
Which is, at this point, during the French Revolution, kind of the best anyone could ask for.
Exactly. I can't imagine living in that time.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. You just never know who do you side with, because tomorrow maybe that's going to be the next enemy. Yeah.
Right.
So this is the final chapter of his life, I guess, is the army stuff. But as you mentioned, he went to Belgium to do a concert. Like, he was still doing, I think he assembled an orchestra in Lille, sort of similar to the Concert des Amateurs.
I do think he was involved in music again. He couldn't fully separate himself from his passion, his music, his audience. And there was demand for it. There was still an interest in his musical genius, his musical talent. And so, of course, it makes sense that, towards the end of his life, which is, sad to say because that's coming in 1799, that he did eventually find his violin again. It's not that he abandoned his music completely to, become to join the National Guard or to, fight for the cause of the Patriots. His music was still always there with him. Yeah.
And I mean, yes, so we're getting close to 1799, and that is when he had an illness and he passed away.
Yeah.
I mean, what I wanted to talk to you as well about is his legacy afterwards.
Right. In 1799, he dies, and a lot is happening in that year. His death is one thing, but it's also, as historians will say, the end of the French Revolution, because it's when the start of, Napoleon and that era that leads us to the First Empire and all that. So it's he has a lot to deal with, a lot to upstage his death. But still, we see in the archives that, there's this outpouring of, sadness, not just in France, but in Europe, where people are writing about, his greatness. And one author, an anonymous person, but still printed in the Paris journals, is, upset about the way in which France has commemorated the passing of this man, that we should be ashamed of how we treated him, that, we look back at this time and just, be really embarrassed by how we treated him. And I do think, those words are actually true. I mean, I do think what happened it wasn't until maybe 2002 that we have some sort of, recognition in Paris of his legacy, when you have the creation of this, the renaming of a street. It's a tiny street in Paris, you can maybe do the length of it in, I don't know, a minute or so. But, so like 2 centuries, between his death and 2002, what happened? What happened to his legacy? And this leads me to just ask the question: what was his true legacy, like right after his death? I mean, were people really interested in his talent, or were they interested in, his, I don't know, his ability to be exploited for the reason of fiction? Like, he was, we could make up stories about where he came from, make up stories about, his endowment, make up stories about, his sexual, appetite, make up stories about, the color of his skin and what that means about his intellect, what it means about, his I don't know, his origin, I just wonder if, because in the 19th century, there are plays written about him, there are novels written eventually, there's still, people were making money by rendering him in a fictionalized way. And I'm wondering if, a lot of the damage done to his legacy, I do think, is just based on the original impetus in the 18th century that really drew people to him. Was it truly an understanding of him as a French citizen who was as talented as other French musicians, or was there something else in terms of maybe exoticism that was holding him in the limelight? And so that's something I'm still working on. But it's true that in the 21st century, we had the creation of the term Black Mozart. We had Black Don Juan before, I guess, in the 19th century, but Black Mozart, which was used as a way to maybe draw attention to him. And it's still being used today, by the way, because Mozart is, his legacy is intact. He's a a famous Austrian composer. Everyone knows about Mozart, and if even people who don't really understand or don't care for classical music, you play, the opening bars of the March of Figaro, like, oh yeah, I know that. It's Mozart. So to call him Black Mozart is to say, okay, if you love Mozart, you know anything about this man, can you imagine a person in the 18th century who could have been considered the Black Mozart? And so it's a way to bring a lot of interest, a lot of curiosity to the exploration or discovery of Saint-Georges, and I think it had its moment. It did what it was intended to do. It did garner some attention in the 21st century for Saint-Georges, and has led now to, I do think, what is a true reimagining and also just a resurgence of Saint-Georges' work in the 21st century. Operas are being staged, orchestras are programming his music. There are festivals that happen every year in Guadaloupe, in different parts of North America, different parts of Europe, and so I would say he's being restored to full glory. And I do think this time, I don't think it's about the fiction. I don't think it's about whether or not we can say this was a Black Mozart or whether or not this was a Black Don Juan. It's like, no, this is just truly, ingenious music, and people are, appreciating it on that level, which I think is great.
I do just want to point out to the listeners, like how I came across you, as a potential guest for the podcast, was you wrote this academic paper about the Black Mozart concept. And one of the points that I thought was very strong, I mean, it was a great article and I invited you on the podcast, so obviously I appreciate it a lot. But one of the things I remember you said in that was he was more famous than Mozart in his life.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. So, that's why I really took umbrage with the term Black Mozart, because it made us feel as if he was the one imitating or trying to be like Mozart, whereas the opposite, Mozart's dad told young Mozart, who was struggling to, get his career off the ground, when you go to France, make sure that you seek out, this orchestra and Saint-Georges, because, this guy's all the rage in France. And if you want to, start your career and become more prominent, as a composer, as a performer, try to get a commission from Saint-Georges. Because, as I said before, if Saint-Georges is on your program, if he's anywhere in your entourage, you have interest, you have eyes on you, you have money, you have, people coming in. So it makes sense that, Leopold Mozart would have told his son, Wolfgang, yeah, if you're in France, seek out this guy. So, and not many people would have known that, just thinking about the term Black Mozart. It makes it seem as if, well, Mozart was all the rage, and there's someone who tried to be like him who happened to be Black, which is really striking for me and upsetting, actually.
No, exactly, and yeah, your essay makes this point very strongly. But I just wanted everybody to know that St. George was there first.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And he was more successful at that time. So I emailed you these kind of categories that I usually. As kind of a fun way to end the episodes, which we'll see how St. George does in these various categories. I'm very interested to hear what you're going to say for each of them. But the first category is the scandalousness. How scandalous was he seen by society at the time? And I'm curious because he was widely, in many ways, because he was making money for so many people, he was widely accepted. He was invited to all of these parties.
Yeah, listen, I think he was a very scandalous person. I mean, in the way he discarded of tradition. Like, when you think of the French Academy, when you think of just, music theories and different treaties of harmony, and he shows up and says, you know what, I'm going to do it this way, And, luckily it worked, meaning people, were, I guess, hungry for something new, hungry for something, that they hadn't seen before, right? And it kind of worked, I guess, that he was so peculiar, with the color of his skin, to his origins, to the way he, it all worked, that this person would be the one to warp French traditions, right? I think luck it was on his side, that it kind of pleased the taste of the the concert goers. But also in athletics and fencing, and the way he just did his own thing, I would give him a solid 7 for being a scandalous person.
Absolutely,
yeah.
I agree, and I think we've said so many things about him. I just was like, oh, that's right, he did do these new and interesting ways. Didn't you say some of his music required people to hold a violin in a different way?
Yeah,
that's
these tremendous jumps and different let's say tonalities, and just you had to, as a human, first of all say, well, can my body do that? Can my fingers do that? And if you wanted to have a job, you wanted to be a part of his entourage, you wanted to be in his shine, of course you'd find a way to play his music. So he pushed human potential as well, which I think is tremendously interesting.
Yeah, and that's part of where I just feel like he feels like such a contemporary type figure, that so many people in his era were just kind of doing what was expected, and he was just like, that's not for me. I'm just gonna
right. I'm doing my own thing, and hey, it works.
Yeah, which is exactly. He definitely set himself apart in that way, as well as how he was already set apart to a lot of people because of the color of his skin. So the next category is the scheminess. how much, and I think this is going to be a very high number. I think
I agree.
he was always, he could find an angle. He knew he had the celebrity. He knew people were going to bet on him. And he was able to leverage that to really elevate his success.
I agree completely. I mean, with everything you said. And, that's how he had to survive, as a performer. You're working for, you live for the applause. As who said that? Who sang
Lady
that?
Gaga.
There you go. As Lady Gaga said, you live for the applause. Literally, he needed to, secure. He had to, understand the taste of the people, who were going to concerts. He had to appease them at every moment for them to come back, for them to pay, for them to, help him to make a living. And he moved from being, from fencing to violin to orchestral composition to opera composition, to the National Guard, to boxing, all of that, and it's true that he did these things deliberately. I don't think he was just pulled along by life and by happenstance. For the French opera, it's true that in 1768, just curiously, randomly, a poem appeared in the Mercure Galant, which is this, journal that, all the powerful people of France read. And there's this poem written about Saint-Georges, and it says, he's the genius of taste and talent. That's great. But then it ends by saying, how wonderful. Can you imagine if this talent, if he ever married music and words, he would be an Apollo. Just randomly, that's how this poem just comes out of nowhere and says, well, he has done so well in orchestral music. Can you imagine if he became, an opera composer? And I believe that I was, strategically placed there to, have the right eyes read it so that, when St. George went up to become the director of Paris, the opera, it wouldn't be a surprise. Because so it's not just St. George on his own being pulled on. No, there are other, investors, capitalists, as they call them, who are setting him up to, use his celebrity to, be entered to I don't know, be elected to high power and positions for them to, maybe benefit eventually from him. So a lot of skeeviness, I think, not just for him, but for all the people around him. So I gave him a solid 10. I gave him full 10 for this, highest marks.
I agree. I think he always was thinking 10 steps ahead and knowing and because of like how he needed to keep going, like he was going contract to contract, like he just always had to find a way to make money and to keep going. And I think it's admirable that he, like you said, he wasn't just sort of floating along as life happened to him. He was making things happen. And that's part of what's so notable and important about his life. So the next one, I can guess what you're going to say, but I want to hear your explanation. The significance.
Yeah, here again, I give him high marks, and it's really curiously, it's because of what we don't know about him. I feel as if for, scholars, anyone, if there are gaps in our knowledge, it usually it forces us to look harder and to try harder to fill those gaps in, And so here we have a person that we don't really understand his unique profile as a historical figure, a person of mixed race with this talent who was able to, enter these, high positions of power. He's a peculiar case. And, we need to, first of all, figure out his profile. Like, as a historical figure, how do we, understand his, particular profile? What new connections can we make with existing knowledge? How can we, create, new points of focus? How can we answer some questions, and maybe figure out, maybe how we can write his legacy equitably? All of that forces us to just, go back to the archives and to, look at this entire early modern period differently. And all historians and all, scholars of this period benefit from that, right? Just from a focus on Saint-Georges. And so for that reason alone, I give him like a 9, because he pulls us back into the century. and forces us to answer questions that we didn't think we were even going to ask, So, yeah, I think it is a lot for the Academy as well. Yeah.
And then I don't know how to discuss this next category, but when I started this podcast, we were only talking about women, and I can't retroactively change the scale, so because then I have to redo everyone's scale. So the final category is sexism, but I do think of the many things that, I think racism was obviously a major challenge for him, but I do think sexism can be seen as part of the story, and how I gave you this challenge. How can we score this? But what did you think about this?
I think because of his position again in theater, he was in circles of men, privileged circles of men, but circles of women as well. So he understood the life cycle of women. I do think, he understood how sexism affected them. And, if we look at, this idea of women moving between three positions or three zones of protection, so at home, in the family, either the patriarch, the brother, the father, whatever. And then from there, moving to the protection of the husband. And then from the husband, depending on, how the marriage goes, if it's if the woman is widowed and, it doesn't have inheritance, or even if there is some sort of inheritance, the woman might then end up in the convent, So it's only certain women who had, a lot of it, let's say, endowment from the passing of their husband, and they're able to maybe have some agency then that's when their lives really took off. Like, they were a true sense of freedom. But for Saint-Georges, he was with women who were mostly in the second category, under the protection of their husbands, where it was understood for these women that, this marriage is not one of love. It's one of convenience. It's one of, status. It's one where you're expected almost, and it's rumored about, and maybe it's real, it's imagined, but you're expected to have these different affairs, clandestine liaison. And you're expected to survive, find a way to, get some sort of happiness before, your husband, who is maybe 36 years older than you are, passes off and you have some freedom. So there is Saint-Georges in the middle of this, who is somehow caught up in these, rumors about the goings on in the private chambers. He was linked to Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette, of course, a lot of pornographic literature came out about her. Like the scandals, and I'm pretty sure he was caught up in this too. It was rumored about what he might have been doing with Marie Antoinette, with other women, and of course rumors about his sexuality, sexual appetite, what he liked, and how large, how vigorous, all of that, And so I do believe indirectly he would have been, affected by this discrimination against women for their own, sexuality as well, and their sexual freedom, So I think because of that, right, I do think indirectly he was touched by sexism, and so I put him at a 5. Right, but there could be more too, because the first opera he wrote was called Ernestine, and it was based on a famous novel by a writer, Madame Riccoboni. So a woman author of the time, bestseller. But the novel was about entering the psyche of a woman, a young woman coming out into society, and just the grappling that she has to do with honor, her own honor and virtue and pride, and trying to navigate the very difficult world of courtship and all that. And Saint-Georges chose that as his first opera. Sure, Marie Antoinette had a copy of the book in her possession, but why was he so keen on representing this literary figure on stage? Was it solely because of the popularity of the book? Was it because he actually knew all too well, and he somehow maybe identified with this idea of non-freedom, this identity of maybe restriction imposed upon oneself by the patriarchy, So yeah, I put him at a 5, but it could be even higher, 5 to 7, I believe, for this category.
So when I add all those scores up, his total score is a 31, which I'll just let you know just of other people who I've done on the podcast who have a similar score. Do you know Sally Hemings, the American Thomas Jefferson's enslaved mistress?
Yes.
She has a 32.
Well,
So he's,
Okay. Okay. Good.
So in terms of, like Black history, like those two are in the same neighborhood. Nefertiti, the Egyptian queen, she's a 31.5.
Wait a minute. Okay.
So he's in some very good company here.
Yeah, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That's good to know.
Yeah. No, I think in this scale on this podcast, anyone who gets a 30 or above is like quite notable, because it's rare for somebody to score highly in all of the categories. But I think he was such a exceptional person that he kind of has all these different qualities, like to have the significance and the scandal and the scheminess. It's rare, but he really had all of those things.
Yeah, and you know what? We're just scratching the surface. I think there's so much more to discover. So we'll keep going.
Exactly. I think people like you who are looking in archives and finding facts, and like you said, that pamphlet. I'm excited to see what you figure out with that. Because I think there is so much more.
Wish me luck.
I just think there's so much more to know, and it takes people like you who are doing the work and digging around.
Thank you. I'm wishing for luck and patience and magic almost, because sometimes those archives are very daunting. So yeah.
Do you have any? I mean, I'll just ask you if you have any final thoughts you wanted to say just about St. George in general.
I would say just a huge thank you to you and for your work, because I think we're all pulling together in the same direction, just trying to, really honor the legacy of this man and to not, really engage with any sort of fiction about his life, to really take the time to do good work and to equitably present him to, today's world, as a leading, historical figure who was, a pioneer in so many different ways. So thank you for this podcast, and thank you to your audience as well for engaging with this work. And it'd be great to see how far we can go.
Well, and I mean, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a topic. I find him such a fascinating figure, but I didn't feel equipped to explain the story thoroughly myself. And when I came across your work, I thought, oh, I hope I can get this man on the podcast, because I feel like you're the person to really get people excited about this. And I think I'm right. So
I hope so. Thank you so much for your kindness. Thank you so much, Anne.
So thank you again to Julian Ledford for joining us today for this very special episode. I think this story is so important to know. I think Joseph Bologne, the Chevalier of Saint-Georges, is such a significant figure. And actually, after the interview, I came across a quote from this recent GQ interview with Beyonce, who was talking about why she sampled some music by the Chevalier de Saint-Georges in her recent album, Cowboy Carter. I'm going to read this quote from Beyonce. So she said, "This is why it was so important for me to sample the composer Joseph Bologne, known as Chevalier de Saint-Georges, in the song Daughter on Cowboy Carter. Violin Concerto in D major, Opus 3, number 1, number 2, Adagio, was created in the 1700s. This is a testament to Chevalier's vision. I hope it inspires artists as well as fans to dig deeper and learn more about the Black musical innovators who came before us. Some of the most talented artists never achieve the mainstream praise they deserve, especially when they defy the norm." And I thought this was just, it just seemed so perfect that I came across this quote just after I had spoken with Julian, because it's so much of what he was saying about the importance of the Chevalier, but also his increased prominence and how more people are hearing about him. So I actually shared that quote with him after, and he said, this is Julian, I'm quoting him now from an email. "I wanted to mention that I think St. George is on the way to becoming the most popular 18th century French composer. Beyonce may be a great catalyst in realizing that." So I think it's wonderful that the profile of St. George is becoming more broadly known, including in the recent film just called Chevalier, in which Kelvin Harrison Jr. plays St. George. And I would recommend that film. I didn't bring it up with Julian because I didn't want to get into all that stuff in our discussion, but I do think that Kelvin Harrison Jr.'s charisma sells that whole entire movie. And once you know the story of the real St. George, you can see how the movie took those facts and spun it into this narrative. And it features a whole bunch of music by the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. And we also talked about it on one of the episodes of Vulgar Peace Theater, which is the Patreon-only podcast I do. So you can watch the movie, then you can hear our review of it as well. Anyway, what I want to let you know is that, so we scored St. George on the Fredegund Memorial Scandaliciousness scale. And if you want to see the full scale and who is on it and where everybody lands in these 4 categories, you can find that on my website, which is vulgarhistory.com. And there's like a button there that says scores. So you can kind of see where everybody goes, see where your fave has landed in this list as well. And I also want to mention that I recently made an appearance on a podcast called Content and Capable, which is a podcast hosted by an Australian man named Sam. And we had a really, really interesting conversation talking about the connections, like why I started the Vulgar History podcast and the importance of learning about history and how history relates to modern things and how modern things are history. It's a really interesting, in-depth conversation. I really would invite you to all listen to it. So just look up Content and Capable podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And also, since you're here, I will let you know a few other things. So I do have a Substack newsletter, which is where it's free. And that's where I share my history writing. You know, I'm writing a book, and so I need to flex my writing skills. And so you can kind of know what my writing is like. So when the book comes out, you'll know what that's like. Anyway, so every 2 weeks, I post an essay there. And if you subscribe, you subscribe to it with your email address. And then it just lands in your inbox every 2 weeks, a little essay by me, by a scandalous woman or other person from history. Most recently, I wrote about Jeanne de la Motte, so timely for this Marie Antoinette season. You can find that at vulgarhistory.substack.com. And you can also support the podcast on Patreon. And I have news about this, actually. So you go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. That's where you go. And you can become a free member, which what that gets you is basically some of the things I post there go out to everybody, including the free members. And one of those things is a new spin-off podcast, because I'm not busy enough, that is called Anne is Writing a Book. And that is where, so I am writing this book about Caroline of Brunswick. And there's so many things I want to tell you about it. And the book doesn't come out for ages. So just so you can kind of join me on the journey of writing the book. So everybody who joins the Patreon at every level, including free members, can get these kind of casual, random episodes. I say random because it's not like every Tuesday. It's just kind of like when I'm writing and I want to talk to you about something. So that's an incentive for you to join the Patreon, even for free, to get the updates from me about my book that I'm writing. And also, if you want to take it up a notch, if you join the Patreon for $1 or more a month, sort of like a subscription, I guess, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History. Like usually it comes out on a Wednesday. For these people at the $1 a month on Patreon, they get it on a Saturday. So you get like a few days advance notice what the episodes are going to be. But also people at this $1 a month level, you get ad-free access to all previous episodes as well. So if you want to like binge listen to a bunch of Vulgar History without the ad break in the middle, that's where you can do that. And also, if you pledge $5 or more a month, you get even more. So you get access to bonus episodes of things like Vulgar Piece Theater, where I review costume dramas, or not review, just kind of like chat for like 2 to 3 hours and record it with friends of the podcast, Alison Epstein and Lana Johnson. And again, we have done an episode about Chevalier, the movie about Chevalier de Saint-Georges, it was so interesting to watch that movie and talk about it and then to do this research. And so to kind of see some of the things in the movie that we weren't sure about, turns out actually came from sexual life. And some things we weren't sure about in the movie were just movie magic. And then also at that $5 a month level, you get access to the after show, which is where sometimes I invite the show, people who are guests on the show, to just like kiki about other topics. And also So This Asshole, where I talk about men from history who were shitty. I do want to say that I am going to be talking about this season about some other men from history who were maybe not shitty here in the main feed. So, you know, what is a binary? Like, we're a feminist women's history comedy podcast, and we talk about various genders, mostly women, but sometimes other people. Anyway, I also wanted to say too, all the stuff about the bonus episodes on Patreon. If you're like, that sounds great, but I don't want to like log into a website to listen to podcasts, you don't have to. Because once you become a Patreon member, you can connect. You get a special feed that you can put into Spotify, or you can put into Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And so the episodes will just show up in your regular feed. They just happen to maybe not have ads in them if you're at the $1 a month level. Or if you're at the free level, the Anne is Writing a Book will just show up there. Anyway, it's all really super smooth, and Works great. Isn't technology wonderful? If you join the Patreon, like all the instructions are there for how you can get that set up. Also, people at the $5 or more a month Patreon get to join the Vulgar History Salon, which is our Discord, which is just like a place where we chat and talk about things like we talk about what do our pets look like, or we talk about like who's your favorite history teacher, like why are you interested in history, sharing memes. It's a nice time. And also, I could not wrap up this podcast without mentioning our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry, who just released a whole bunch of beautiful gemstone pieces, actually. So Common Era Jewelry is a women-owned small business that is creating beautiful heirloom pieces of jewelry, either in gold or solid gold, as well as in more affordable gold vermeil. And these pieces include some that feature the faces, the heads of various women from classical mythology, as well as from history. And so this includes people who we've talked about on the podcast, like Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina, Anne Boleyn showed up there. People we haven't talked about on the podcast, but who are great women to wear in a necklace, like Olga of Kiev is there, Cassandra from mythology. Hatshepsut has a necklace. You can get 15% off your order from Common Era using code VULGAR at checkout, or going to commonera.com/vulgar, or using code VULGAR at checkout. And again, there are some beautiful new pieces. I'm excited to see what Tori, the owner, is going to release next, but there are these beautiful new ones with gemstones as well. You can also buy Vulgar History merchandise, including our Princess Diana outfit fall season varsity crew neck sweatshirt, which says Vulgar History. Gosh, it's a funny thing. What does it say? Not taking history seriously since 2019, because guess what? It's coming up our 5-year anniversary. So anyway, it's a beautiful design by friend of the podcast, Karen Moynihan, and other merchandise is available there as well. Stickers, pins, lots of great things. So you can get your Vulgar History merchandise. If you're in the US, you go to vulgarhistory.com/store. If you're not in the US, you can go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And if you want to get in touch with me, I love hearing from all of you always. And you can get in touch with me if you go to vulgarhistory.com. There's a little contact me button there. If you go to Instagram, I am at Vulgar History Pod, and you can send me a DM there as well. I love to see people who are traveling to places where we've talked about on the show and showing me things. Like there was a listener who recently sent me a picture. They were in Philadelphia and saw the President's House memorial to Ona Judge, and I was so moving to see like a video, of Ona being remembered there, like we talked about in those episodes, her footprints leaving the house. So if you go to one of these places that we've talked about on the show, please send me pictures. And you can send those to me Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, or go to my website, vulgarhistory.com, and send me a little email. Next week, we are having a very special guest. I think you're all going to be very excited to hear from a return guest. And we're going to be talking about another person whose story combines what we talked about in part 1 with the American Revolution with what we're getting into now in part 2 with the Versailles of it all. Marie Antoinette is going to make another appearance, and I'm excited for you all to hear next week's episode. And until then, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History Show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Speight.
We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
What's up, everyone? It's Noah Daniels.
Hey, y'all. I'm JJ.
Hey, guys. It's Kat.
And we're your hosts of the Real Hauntings podcast, where we bring on guests who share their first-hand encounter ghost stories and supernatural experiences. Now on to the trailer.
I've been warned to not tell this story, but I think because of the way it ends, it's okay to tell this story, because some people say that with certain entities, to like speak of them or talk about them or in any way like portray them as powerful will attract them to other people. The creepiest thing about it to me is a lot of times it would wait for me to notice it. Like, it would just lay its arm out like this, and then I'd be like, where is it? Where is it? And then I'd see it, and then it would just slither back.
For more information on the Real Hauntings, Real Ghost Stories podcast, make sure you check out Real.fm to learn more about our podcast and many other amazing podcasts.